Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on navigating the 2023 cyber threat landscape. My name is Alan Calder. I'm your host for this afternoon. I'm the author of a bunch of books on cybersecurity. I'm also, as it happens, the chief executive of IT Governance and of its parent company, which is GRC International Group. The webinar this afternoon is coming to you from IT Governance. We are market leaders in ISO 27001. We've been doing cybersecurity for about 20 odd years. We've trained a large number of people on information security. We're Cyber Essentials and PCI QSA. We're a CREST accredited penetration testing and incident responder, and across the group we have a range of different organizations that deliver a range of services that different organizations need to get from us. The agenda for today is to have a look at the cyber threat landscape for 2023. We're going to talk about why cybersecurity is a board-level issue. We're going to look at cyber defense in depth and cyber resilience, practical steps for building a cyber defense in depth strategy and some best practice solutions for it. I'm going to probably talk for about 45 minutes or so through the presentation that we've got prepared for you, and then there will be an opportunity for questions, but it's entirely possible that you'll have questions as we go through the webinar. So please, you will have noticed that you're muted. That's to try and avoid kind of background disturbance and so on. Please do use the question and answer function, which is in your GoToWebinar dashboard. You should see an option called questions sat in your dashboard. If you type into it questions as we go, the microphone is on. If you type into it questions as we go, you should be able to, I'll be able to pick up your questions when we come to the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. I'll be able to go through the questions that you've posted. I'll share the webinars, share the questions with the audience, and then to the extent that I can provide you all with the answer. So hoping that the one person with a microphone question is not the question everybody else is sharing, and that everybody else can see the slides and the screen. I'm going to push on. So, cyber landscape today, looking ahead to 2023, cybersecurity should be seen, says the World Economic Forum, as a strategic business issue that impacts decision-making. Ransomware will attack a device every 2 seconds by 2031, up from 11 seconds in 2021. Cybercrime damages will increase by an average of 15% per annum, so we'll be up from 3 trillion in 2015 to something like 10.5 trillion by the year after next. The SEC in the US is proposing that organizations should be forced to report cyber breaches and ransomware payments, which will put a huge amount of pressure on boards to demonstrate that they actually do have in place cybersecurity controls that are appropriate for the challenges with which they're dealing. The workforce gap in cybersecurity is about 3.4 million people globally, so there are not enough people around to help organizations deal with cybersecurity on the basis of the roles that are currently being recruited for. 90% of cyber incidents in the UK could have been prevented if people had followed the basics of cybersecurity, said Lindy Cameron, president of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre last year, with the global average cost of a data breach increasing to $4.3 million in 2022, the highest recorded by IBM Securities since it launched its annual cost of a data breach report. In fact, said the NCSC at the back end of last year, cyber attacks are a major challenge to businesses and public services in the UK. So how should boards respond to a major challenge? Well, the first thing is to understand the cyber threat landscape. The cost of a breach, as I've said, has increased to $4.3 million on average since in 2022. That's a 13% increase over 2020. You ask a question, how much on average should we be spending on defending yourselves? And the answer is probably marginally less than 4.3 million, but it shouldn't be just hundreds of thousands of dollars. You should be spending at least as much as you're trying to save, because the number of breaches you have is not limited to one in your lifetime. 95% of cybersecurity breaches are caused by human error. And as of December last year, investment fraud is the most costly form of cybercrime, with the average loss per victim of about $71,000. On average, cyber attackers in well-organized organizations, but nevertheless on average, have 11 days inside the target before they're detected, and some businesses have taken up to 9 months to identify and contain a data breach. So it's not as though a breach happens, you spot it, you can deal with it. The reality is that cyber attackers get into your network, embed themselves, do a whole lot of damage long before you've identified that they're in there. And the impact of those organizations, and this is just looking at breaches which have occurred in 2023. Reddit breached on the 5th of February. An attacker got hold of the credentials of one whole employee. Using those credentials, was able to get access to some internal documents as well as some internal dashboards and business systems, and that enabled them to exploit the intrusion. Sharp Healthcare had a data breach affecting nearly 63,000 patients as a result of an attack on a website. Social security numbers, health insurance, health records, all compromised. But Ye said Sharp Healthcare bank details were safe, as though the compromise of social security numbers, health insurance, and everything else wasn't a major problem in the first instance. T-Mobile just had yet another high-profile cyber attack. 37 million customers in the data breach, their data compromised. Intruders had access to the data since late November. In 2021, T-Mobile had an attack which affected 76 million customers, and at that point said it would spend $150 million to upgrade its cybersecurity, but not enough because it's had another data breach. MailChimp, 133 MailChimp accounts affected. A social engineering attack similar to a previous breach raising questions about how good MailChimp's shifts in its security protocols were. That's current cyber attacks. As we say, the only thing certain in life these days is death, taxes, and cyber breaches. And cyber breaches don't happen in a vacuum. Regulators are hard at work forcing organizations in the EU, the UK, in different states in the US, and across the world to put in place better practices around protecting personal data. And those practices don't just involve making sure that organizations are able to defend against cyber attacks. It involves making sure that organizations are behaving properly around personal data. And there is a growing number of organizations getting fined for violating in the EU GDPR principles and obligations. So Hellenic DPA fined Clearview AI 20 million euros for violating GDPR. WhatsApp has been fined 5.5 million euros by the Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland for unlawfully processing personal data without telling data subjects what it was doing. TikTok has had a 5.4 million euro fine over opting out of cookies. And the reason for talking about GDPR and privacy compliance in the same session as talking about cybersecurity is, of course, it's one other aspect of the way in which you manage personal data is going to impact on the profitability of the organization. Whether you're doing it in a way that leads to regulatory action and fines, or you're managing personal data in a way that leads to breaches and fines, you still need to have a integrated, joined up approach to managing data, because personal data breaches, cyber breaches, are kind of different ways of describing similar issues. And the cyber threat environment is deteriorating, it's not improving. The average time to identify and contain a data breach in 2022 was, in 2021, this is the 2022 report, was 277 days. That's the best part of 3/4 of a year. Average cost, as you know, $4.3 million. One stolen record on average now costs the organization that was breached about $164 US. So you think about, on average, we have 20,000 records compromised, 50,000 records compromised at $1.64, whatever the exchange rate is. That kind of gives you a quantum for what that cost is. And that's a cost which is made up of a number of things, which includes lost business, but also cost of rebuilding, recovering, dealing with the attack, regulatory fines. It's an expensive business being breached. Average value of lost business per breach, $1.4 million. Data breach costs continue accruing up to 2 years post the event. It depends, it varies by sector. So in highly regulated sectors, the costs of the breach are usually dealt with within between 6 and 9 months. But in unregulated sectors, where almost by definition cybersecurity practices are more lax, costs of the breach can go on accruing up to 2 years after the breach takes place. 83% of organizations have more than one breach a year. And there are many cases where phishing attacks are mounted against the same vulnerability by 2 or 3 different cyber attackers within a matter of hours, because they will kind of follow the same opportunities. Organizations have more than one breach a year. 45% of breaches occurred in the cloud. It's worthwhile noticing that many organizations have migrated to cloud over the course of the last couple of years, not just because of the number of people working from home or working remotely, but because they think it's more secure. Actually, inadequate cloud configuration, inadequately secure cloud configuration is behind 45% of the breaches which took place. Pretty critical issues when, as a management team, you think about how do we deal with cyber security. Many organizations go, well, we need to deploy technology. Big investments in all sorts of cybersecurity technology. Bruce Schneier, who was once CTO at British Telecom, is pretty well one of the longest running cybersecurity gurus, says if you think technology can solve your security problems, then you don't understand the problems and you don't understand the technology. And echoing from the other side of the fence, Kevin Mitnick, who styled himself as the world's most famous hacker, he got caught in the end and came clean, said companies spend millions of dollars on firewalls, encryption, and secure access devices, and it's money wasted. None of these measures address the weakest link in the security chain. And the weakest link is the human being. So the challenge for all organizations is not how do I spend that minimum $1.4 million US on technology. It's how do I spend an appropriate amount of money to ensure that the human beings are not going to be my weakest link. And the challenge when thinking about human beings is that human beings work in a digital environment. They send and receive data. They operate in a software environment. All of those provide opportunities for people to make mistakes. And most human mistakes are simply that. The breaches which come about are because somebody made a mistake. They made an error in what they clicked on, how they responded to something, they weren't adequately trained. It's not necessarily an insider attack. It's just simply an error. And the most common attack vectors are compromised credentials. It's somebody whose password is password or 123456 or QWERTY, because, hey, who would ever be able to guess that? People whose password practices don't meet the kind of standard requirements of complex, long, difficult passwords, who repeat passwords on multiple websites. So compromised credentials, phishing attacks, second most common attack vector, clicking on a link from an email that looks as though it's going to be interesting or contains information that you might want. And phishing attacks are really sophisticated, hard for most people to distinguish them these days. You distinguish them if you say, was I really expecting this email? Better check. Cloud misconfiguration, the third most common vulnerability, and software vulnerabilities, an unpatched vulnerability, cross-site scripting, something in a website that enables an attacker to take advantage. And, software vulnerabilities, again, is a human error in coding, inadequate process. You can think of all of that as saying cybersecurity is about what? Protecting you from ever having a breach? No, because it's not a question of if I do enough, will I be able to avoid a breach? It's actually, the reality is sooner or later you are going to be breached. And that's a kind of practical reality, which as a management team, you've got to take on board when you think about cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is a board level issue because it's fundamentally about governance, risk management, and compliance. It's about trying to determine what controls you put in place to deal with a clear and present danger. So just to summarize some of the issues and the ways to think about them. 43% of attacks target small businesses. What as those cyber attackers are going, we're only going to go after large businesses. You might think that, today's news that WH Smith is suffering from a cyber attack is proof they only go after big businesses, but it's the big businesses which make the headlines. Small businesses don't. Small businesses, as often as not, go out of business as the result of a cyber attack, but 43% of cyber attacks focus on small and medium enterprises because they don't have as much money to spend on cybersecurity. They don't have their defenses are not necessarily as up to date. And from an attacker's point of view, if you can, extort £5,000 or £25,000 from 20 different small businesses, it's probably as easy as trying to get $1 million from one large organization. 83% of small businesses aren't equipped to recover from a cyber attack. They just don't have the financial resources to be able to handle the steps that it might take in terms of continuity and recovery. They don't have insurance in place. They're just not equipped to recover from a cyber attack. And the volume of what's going on is huge. It's not as though it's a small number of cyber attackers, 3.1 million spoofed emails sent every day. And the cost of scam messages, 23 billion euros since 2016. Organizations on average spend 3.4 million euros, about $3.9 million to recover from cyber attacks. So you've got a breach. The biggest cost that you then accrue is how do you recover? There's lost business that comes on after that, and you can save money if you accept that you're going to be breached, which you will be, simply by having good incident response processes in place. So if you're able to identify and contain a data breach within 200 days, and that's not easy. You need to have properly prepared incident response retainers, but you can reduce your costs by something in the order of, on average, 1.1 million euros. Remote workers increase the cost of a data breach because if you have people working from home, it usually costs you more to respond to data breaches. Communication is more expensive, the infrastructure is more complex, and more organizations, whatever management might like, are going to go on having remote workers. That's a kind of reality of today's business environment. And so if you look at it as a board, the truth is successful defense is hard. Stopping cyber attacks at the perimeter so that you're safe, that's really, really hard. It's impractical, in fact, to think about doing. So breaches are inevitable. You've got to think about containment and recovery as key capabilities. You've only got to be successful in defending yourself 100% of the time. 100% of the thousands of attacks which are mounted against you on a regular basis, you have to defend against all of them. All of the phishing emails which come in to your employees have to not click on any single one of those links. The attacker only needs one to work, and they're in. So you've got to just recognize it's not if, but when. And so what as a board, what as a management team do you do? You've got to therefore think about cybersecurity as a senior management priority, a board level concern. There are financial implications for the organization. There is reputational damage. We're an organization, we're providing good services, customer data, staff data is safe. Now suddenly it isn't. That has a reputational impact on the organization. And directors have a responsibility to protect reputation as well as to protect assets. There's a regulatory compliance impact, can lead to fines, can lead in some jurisdictions to court actions against the organization, class action suits, a whole range of legal exposures which are not a lot of fun, can lead customers to bring legal actions against you. So you need to be thinking about cybersecurity not just from a defense perspective, but also from a business continuity point of view. How, if we're attacked, do we ensure we can continue delivering key services? How do we deal with our legal liabilities? How do we continue adapting to the changing nature of cyber attacks? You've also got to think, as you're thinking about cybersecurity, about GDPR obligations. And these GDPR obligations now are a shoe-in for privacy obligations under most legal systems around the world. The GDPR in Article 5 says organizations have to process data lawfully for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, etc. There are 6 data processing principles, but the 7th effectively says you have to be able to demonstrate compliance with paragraph 1 of Article 5, which is that as an organization, you will be accountable for how you process personal data. So accountability, by definition, you look at data processing principle 6, processed in an appropriate manner to maintain security. It means that accountability in data processing sits right alongside how you deal with cybersecurity. And so you need to think about managing risk, managing as a board, and it's a board's job to manage risk. And there are a number of frameworks to which you can turn, which are designed to help manage risk around personal data and around data and information systems generally. ISO 27001, the most well-known, it's a cybersecurity risk management framework. The National Cybersecurity Center has a 10-step framework to focus on cyber risk. NIST in the US has a cybersecurity framework. PCI has a very detailed security framework for organizations processing personal payment card data, which specifically applies to the environment within which that data is processed. So there are a number of frameworks to which you can turn as you think about what you're going to do. And there are some benefits as a board to taking on a risk-based approach. The first is it means that senior management can arrive at a defined approach, an appetite for risk defined approach to how you're going to do things. You don't need to eliminate every single risk that you have, every single exposure, because frankly, if you did, you'd have to disconnect from the internet, you'd have to refuse to accept incoming data in any form, which would kind of cripple the business. So you have a level of risk that you have to accept by nature of being in business. Board should define what that risk is around cybersecurity, and any one of the frameworks that I identified would enable the board to arrive, particularly ISO 27001, at its own definition of what an acceptable level of risk is, and to put in place controls that are pragmatic, that are appropriate for the risk, that have a cost that you can afford, that enable the business not simply to protect confidentiality and integrity of information, but also to ensure availability of information to people who need it in order to do their jobs. A risk-based approach enables you to target resources on people, process, and technology, on those assets or systems that really need protection, rather than a scattergun approach that fires money across the whole of the organization or gives money to whoever shouts loudest. We need ISO 27001 because this customer insists on it. You need to be much more able to focus on where your real exposures are, where you should be able to invest money, and that helps you reduce costs. And reducing costs in a tough environment is a good thing to do, but it doesn't enable you to eliminate expenditure on cybersecurity. Eliminating cybersecurity expenditure, reducing it too much, simply increases how much you spend on recovery. A good risk-based framework gets management across the organization paying attention to cybersecurity, particularly senior management, on whom you depend to drive the message home across the organization. And above all, should give you real ownership, not just at a board level, but an individual level around specific assets and systems of the risk of exposure and the risk of loss. ISO 27001 recognizes the role of senior management. It says in clause 5.1 that senior management must demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the information security management system, must make sure that the policy and objectives are in line with the strategic direction of the organization, and must make sure that resources needed in order to manage cybersecurity are made available. Management commitment, management drive, management leadership is one of the requirements of ISO 27001. So it's a practical way in which, as an organization, you can demonstrate to stakeholders that senior management is bought in, because the commitment of senior management is audited as part of a compliance audit. So senior management commitment, that's good. How do you put it in place? What does it look like inside an organization? Well, you need to have both cyber and privacy risk on the corporate risk register. There's a level of detail that different organizations will have, but the principle is that both risks should be on the corporate risk director, on the corporate risk register, and there should be a director, one of the non-executives perhaps, as well as an executive who is the board responsible director for cyber and privacy risk, who therefore needs to have either personal knowledge or access to somebody with personal knowledge who can give them insight and guidance, which they can then use to apply oversight of how the organization is dealing with cyber and privacy risk. You need clear roles in place. You need somebody who owns data protection. In some organizations, that would be the DPO, but not in all. A DPO is a regulated role, and you need somebody who's a cybersecurity manager. And cybersecurity managers are usually best not also being the IT manager, because there's a conflict between making systems and software available to people and ensuring that availability is managed within an integrity and confidentiality envelope. You need to build a privacy and compliance framework. So that combines the idea of a PIMS, which is not a summer drink, it's a privacy information management system and an information security management system. You need a combined management system, policies, procedures, work practices, which are designed to ensure that if people comply with them, you achieve your privacy and cybersecurity objectives. You need a cyber incident response process. You're going to be breached, so people need to understand that if they're breached, they need to know what a breach might look like, who to report it to. You need a well-rehearsed set of processes around how to deal with the breach. Cyber Essentials, which is a government-backed minimum cybersecurity standard, deals with 5 technical controls. You should think of as a minimum security standard that any organization should put in place to deal with technical control. It's not enough on its own because it doesn't deal with that big human weakness. It deals with, as I said, 5 technical security controls. And you need to be thinking about, particularly from the point of view of stakeholders and legal compliance, going after ISO 27001, ISO 27701, that's the Personal Information Management System standard certification. And as it becomes available, the Euro Privacy Seal, which is the first European Data Protection Board approved seal that enables an organization to be audited for GDPR compliance and to publish the standard as demonstration that it is actually compliant with GDPR. Quite a good place to be. Doing that will inevitably mean building data protection by design and default into the organization. Data flow audits, that means you need to know what your data flows are, you need to know where the controls are, you need to know where the weaknesses are. You need to do risk assessments and put in place controls selected on the basis of how you want to reduce likelihood and or impact of identified risks. And you need around critical sensitive data, for instance, to be doing data protection impact assessments, and there are legal requirements about how those will be doing. But you should be building over time a systematic approach to cyber security and privacy compliance. We think of that as being cyber defense in depth, and cyber defense in depth gives cyber resilience. So what is cyber defense in depth? What does it kind of look like? We think of cyber defense in depth as being the logical approach. The kind of concept is one that draws on military strategies over centuries of, you know, if people get through the first line of defense, you need the second line of defense, you need the third line of defense. They all need to be slightly different. So you have a ditch and you have a wall, and then you have barbed wire and you have machine guns. What do you have? But it's designed to have different types of defense at different points. Cyber defense in depth follows the same logic. You need a front line of defense, which is about trying to stop the very basic attacks. The basic attacks are the flood of phishing emails that you get, so you need to train people on how to respond, how to recognize them and deal with them. The flood of attacks on software vulnerabilities, so you need continual vulnerability scanning to identify them, and you need an authentication policy to make sure that people, when they authenticate, are doing so in a secure way. Pretty basic, standard preventative activity, detecting and stopping attacks at the perimeter. You then need to get more preventative. Stuff's going to get through that first line of defense, incident response. I've had a breach, who do I report it to? How does the incident response process work? That's pretty critical. Cyber Essentials, security trained IT support staff, GDPR staff awareness training, moving into penetration testing, all of the things which are about making sure that you're able to prevent attacks, once they get through the first line of defense, doing any more damage to the organization. Third line of defense is beginning to think about, actually, where are our crown jewels? Where should we be spending money on building very focused and specific defenses? So embedded risk-based security controls reflected in, for instance, an ISO 27001 certification then becomes a logical, much more all-encompassing route to building out your cyber defense in depth. But risk-based controls, not enough. You need to be thinking about attacks coming in through your supply chain, so extending supply chain security management, building business continuity management, not just what do we do if a server goes down, but what happens if we lose our services, if we are out of action? How do we restore key services to a minimum level of activity within a minimum tolerable period of disruption? So that kind of fourth line of defense, really we're talking resilience here, is critical. And then there is the, it all goes wrong, how do we recover? How do we rebuild? What preparation have we done for rebuilding from scratch? How do we resource that financially? What does our cybersecurity insurance look like? And cyber insurance, of course, is increasingly difficult to get because of the number of successful attacks there have been. And increasingly, you can't get cyber insurance today unless you can demonstrate that you've got many of the key elements of a cyber defense in-depth strategy actually in place. How do you build cyber resilience? Well, you kind of build it from the outside in. Build your first line of defense. First, start scanning all internet-facing IP addresses. Start making sure everybody who receives emails gets perhaps a quarterly phishing update training program. Then move into cyber essentials, penetration testing. Build an incident response process. Get incident response retainers, get in place something that enables you to deal with the likelihood of being breached tomorrow. You don't have any certainty that says if you haven't been breached today, you won't be breached for 6 months. You could be breached today. You could have been breached 4 days ago. So putting in place urgently a method of being able to deal with an incident kind of makes sense. And the logical way of doing that is usually a cyber incident response retainer with an organization that supplies that kind of a service. Then build out a managed response to risk, and then spread it into your supply chain, business continuity, maybe ISO 22301 certification, and then build disaster recovery. 2 years ago, you might have got cyber insurance right up front. Now it's very difficult to do that. So cyber insurance may be something you're only going to get once you've actually built a proper cyber defense in-depth framework. So get on with building cyber defense in-depth is the first key message. Practical steps for doing that. You're a manager, you're a director, what do you do? Well, number one, it's your job, it's the board's job. Take ownership of cyber risk. You can't simply say to the IT team or the IT department or the head of IT, make sure we don't get breached because, hey, it's unfair on them. Their job is usually delivering availability, systems that work, that deliver the mission. You need to be clear about what your appetite for risk is. You need to be clear about how much you're prepared to spend on reducing likelihood and or impact of a cyber attack. And you need to be reviewing progress. Cyber security, privacy compliance, these are board responsibilities. And as KPMG have said, it's something that everybody on the board should be paying attention to. It should be a monthly agenda item on the board's agenda, even if it's simply saying there's nothing to report. There might be a quarterly update on developments, but it should be a standard board item. Board should be in a position to go, here is a major risk, we are satisfied it's under control. The reality, according to PwC, is that just 44% of corporate boards actively participate in the overall security strategy. Many boards still consider it a matter for IT. It's very dangerous. Most of the organizations which are breached, when you dig into them, you find that security was still being treated as an IT issue. The board hadn't taken ownership of it. The board hadn't said, this is a major existential threat to the organization. We need to be all over it. We need to make sure that the defenses we have in place are appropriate for the risks that there are and the threats we face. And that does mean the board needs to inform itself that it's aware of what those are. It also needs to commit budget. There is no way you can be secure without making an appropriate spend. The one approach to determining what your budget should be would be to look at what the biggest impact on the organization could be in block terms of lost business, number of records compromised, and spending perhaps a few percent less than that might be a sensible thing to do, because the reality is when you're breached, you're going to spend all of the money on recovery, and then you're going to find yourself driven by regulators to spend what you should have spent in the first place to avoid the breach taking place. So the cost of responding to the breach you can think of as the kind of saving you make by investing right up front what you should invest. Hackers would tell you that if you're not spending up to 10% of your revenue, you're just not doing enough to keep up with the speed with which they're evolving how they go about attacking organizations. And in particularly recessionary times, organizations and finance teams go, let's try and reduce what we're spending on IT generally, including cybersecurity. The board should be saying, yeah, let's reduce on IT, but not on cybersecurity. That's the one area where we cannot afford to reduce expenditure, because if we have a breach, we're faced with a lot of unplanned expenditure, which is going to have a very negative impact on the organization. Above all, recognize that people are your first line of defense. Remember, favorite attack vectors, compromised credentials, phishing emails. Make sure that you're dealing with those. Make sure that you're deploying staff awareness training and you're updating it regularly. A once a year phishing training exercise is simply not enough. If you're going to give yourself a fighting chance, you're going to deploy a quarterly update on phishing training. You're going to do exams on phishing. You're going to deploy tests which run a simulated phishing attack across the organization and identifies who responds. You're going to intensify training around those people. We find when we do those exercises that it takes probably 3 or 4 simulated phishing attacks to get the number of respondents down below 10%. That's the reality. Remember I said it takes one person to click on an email for the attacker to get in. We find in organizations where we're running simulated attacks, it's very difficult to get down below 10% of people clicking on a well-crafted attack. It's a really challenging issue for boards. So, top steps towards cyber resilience. Scan for vulnerabilities and train staff. Number one, if you're not doing those things, that's the number one thing you should start doing tomorrow. They're very easy to deploy, very inexpensive to deploy. They start giving you results very, very quickly. You might have to do something to deal with what you've learned, but that's the number one step to start building a company-wide cybersecurity awareness culture. Then do an inventory, do a cyber health check across a whole range of areas. How good is our approach to cybersecurity? What are we doing well? What are we doing badly? What else should we be addressing? Whatever the answers of that will give you an action plan. Part of that action plan should be to break down silos. If you have different people responsible for cybersecurity, for legal and for regulatory responses, break that all down, put it in the hands of one person or one team, so that when you're responding to an RFP, it's the same people dealing with that as are going to deal with a customer data access request or a cyber breach, because that way you ensure that across the whole of your organization, you have a joined up approach to dealing with your exposures in those areas. Having tried and tested cyber incident response capability and resources is so important. I'd almost say do that first, except I said do vulnerability scanning and phishing testing first. Maybe you do cyber incident response just a moment afterwards, because once you're breached, you've got to have staff going, okay, I know I have to report this. The one thing you should not do is punish people for being breached, because then they won't report it, then stuff gets worse. You should encourage people to report breaches. You should educate them afterwards. There should be retraining, yes, but people got to report breaches. And you've got to know how you're going to respond. You've got to know what you lock down, what you stop, who you alert, how you carry out. Do you need to do forensics, how you carry that out? Do you have a retention in place with a cybersecurity response team who can be deployed 24/7 to help you deal with the response? Then make sure that you've got tested plans. And testing is the big issue around business continuity plans. The one time to find that they don't work isn't when you're dealing with a major breach. You've got to, on a regular basis, have a testing plan that ensures you're testing your business continuity and disaster recovery plans, so that come the time, we hope it will never happen, but come the time it will work. Then you can make sure that adequate cyber insurance maybe won't cost you as much as it will cost some others, but it's in place to pay for recovery in those circumstances. So 5 key steps towards building genuine cyber resilience inside the organization. Of course, IT governance is here to help organizations do that. Cybersecurity health check is an increasingly core part of our offering, a kind of standardized off-the-shelf offering which we customize where appropriate for different organizations, but will give you in a relatively short space of time a snapshot of cybersecurity compliance and areas in terms of not just technical vulnerabilities, but across the whole GRC piece of where your vulnerabilities and exposures might be. We can help organizations implement ISO 27001. We've got a whole range of tools and services that enable organizations to do it for themselves, but we've also got packages which enable organizations to buy from us a straightforward, we come and do it for you. We adapt something for you, but fundamentally we apply an ISO 27001 management system inside your organization. All of that supported by our Cyber Comply a management platform, which is an integrated management platform that enables you to deal with cybersecurity, privacy, incident response, all of it on a single, robust, well-tested, best-in-class platform. We have an e-learning offering, which I know there are special offers on through the month of March, but which enables you to deploy really good SME-influenced content around helping people understand what they should and shouldn't do in terms of cybersecurity, privacy, GDPR, and a whole broader range of cybersecurity, which can be deployed onto other platforms. You can kind of access it any way you like. And there is much, much more available from the IT governance businesses in the UK and Europe and the United States. So you can go onto our websites, you can call us, you can email us, and we'll help you tackle the challenge of dealing with today's more and more sophisticated cyber threats. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of what I planned to say. I'm kind of weirdly just about on 45 minutes, so I'm happy to take questions. There is, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, a Q&A function. If you look into your GoToWebinar, there is a question bank. You can type a question into that. What I'll do is I'll go through the questions and I'll read out the questions and share answers with you. Am I on mute? I have found that I wasn't, is the answer. Do we have similar statistics that just include the UK? There are similar statistics that include the UK. They're typically available in the Information Security Breaches report from whatever DTI calls itself these days. We're slightly distrustful of them because we know that DTI uses that report to prove that its investment in its cybersecurity strategy is paying dividends, and it's audited by the National Audit Office. It's not, from that point of view, a completely independent report, but you can download it. It's an annual report which will give you data. It generally suggests that breaches in the UK cost less than they do around the rest of the world, and that they're slightly less frequent than they are around the rest of the world. That's another reason why we don't entirely believe that, because we know that cyber criminals don't pick on geographies particularly, unless they happen to be Russian, Chinese, or one of those organizations, one of those countries who are going after Western technology or money, but mostly they go after vulnerabilities. They focus on vulnerabilities wherever they are, and those happen right the way across the world. So that's the question. So our next question. Sorry, somebody having a few Wi-Fi issues. Hopefully you've caught up on all of those, downloaded the handouts. So kind of broad question, the webinar has been recorded. It and the slides will be available to everybody in the course of the next couple of days. They'll be sent out to everybody. The board, right, moving on in terms of questions, the board lacks many times skills in the area. How common is it to establish a separate subcommittee with expertise to support the board, is a very common approach, is either to put up a separate subcommittee with the responsible director who chairs that subcommittee and reports back to the board, or to have external expertise hired to brief the person. But either of those are very normal ways in which to ensure that there is at least one person on the board who is adequately informed, and preferably, as I said, not informed from within the business, because the benefit is to try and draw on external knowledge and expertise to ensure that the business is dealing with a broad range of issues rather than just marking its own homework. So yes, it's a very good and common practice. Training, do we see it focused on phishing and general security practice, or should social engineering be the wider concern, and how do you train in this space? So the answer is that phishing is simply one of the areas of training. It's one of those critical areas because phishing is such a common vector for attack. You can train more broadly around social engineering. We do that quite a lot in staff awareness training, because you can work through a number of different scenarios in a staff awareness scenario. But some of the, depending on your environment, organizations might want to do through live simulated attacks. We do those for organizations as well, but it's a matter of where you're going to get the best return for your investments. And most organizations, we find, get the best return for their investment by deploying staff awareness training on a regular, updated basis across all of their staff, and then focusing in, doing some testing, and then focusing in on areas where there is the greatest ongoing exposure. Would we expect users to report every phishing attack or email they receive to IT? And again, the answer to that is it depends very much on your own environment and your own assessment of risk. So in a small organization where you have, say, 5 people who are really attuned to what's going on, and you perhaps have the extension into Office 365, which enables you to report phishing emails, you might simply say every phishing email you get, just report it through the reporting button. That means that your IT team or security team will see it and will do whatever they want to do with it. But whatever happens, you should certainly dissuade staff from simply filing what they think is a phishing email in their junk folder. I would encourage them at the very least to put it through the Office 365 or whichever email client you're using reporting process. It enables you to have a good track. And bearing in mind that quite often attacks are found 3, 5, 10, 20 days later, to be able to go back through the records and say, it might have been this email, is kind of useful. What top board measurements metric areas would you recommend for this topic? So the key to the board being able to track performance is the board being able to track breaches, to track the number of emails which get through, the number of emails which are reported, the speed of response by the cybersecurity team. Depending on your environment, you might suck in Microsoft security statistics or AWS security statistics. What you're really looking for isn't so much the number of attacks which are identified and defeated because there were no vulnerabilities to get through. You're looking for the number of attacks which get through and are picked up and are then dealt with. You want to know how many vulnerabilities are identified in a vulnerability scan. You want to know as a board in a staff awareness training program how many people fail the test which goes alongside the staff awareness program. If you're running a staff awareness training program with simulated attacks, you want to know what the trajectory over time looks like of a fall off in the number of people who are compromised by the simulated attacks. You want to see data which is showing direction of progress, because, as I said, the reality is you're going to be breached. What you're trying to do is improve security over time. So as a board, you should be looking for evidence that you're doing that. You should be looking at the activities you have in place to drive improvement and tracking how you do that. So when we're doing phishing awareness programs with clients, we deploy staff awareness through an e-learning environment with perhaps a quarterly simulated attack, and we can provide our clients with this is what the staff awareness training looked like, this is what happened in the simulated attack, this is how it compares to last time, this is what we're trying to achieve next time, this is kind of how we might need to improve internal communication. So there's an ongoing process of trying to drive improvements in understanding. The same kind of approach applies to vulnerabilities. You're going to identify vulnerabilities which are critical, high, medium, and low. You're going to ignore most of the low and many of the medium level vulnerabilities, but you're going to want to make sure that critical and high level vulnerabilities are patched fast. But medium level vulnerabilities, you understand what you need to do to spend on those. You're going to want to understand what you're doing about dealing with end of life in software and hardware. All of those are kind of areas to be focusing on. So it's much more, as a board, looking at information around locking down vulnerabilities, locking down configuration exposures in cloud environments. It's about how well your response processes work. Those are the kind of areas to be focusing on as a board. So that's the answer to what would we expect boards to be looking at. Next question, would you expect users to report every phishing attack they email they receive to IT? So again, that's my earlier question. I'd probably suggest the simple thing is make sure you have a reporting button in the email client. Teach everybody that the way to deal with a respected phishing email is simply reported through that automatically. It's then dealt with automatically. You can build a process behind the scenes which has those reviewed on an ad hoc basis or a systematic basis, depending on how you see risk. But I'd have every single phishing email dealt with through a standard process rather than some people just going, that might be, I think I'll ignore it. Because ignoring an email, you don't know whether it's an email that somebody simply has to look at for it to start executing. Report it much better. You've given some ballpark figures for what you could spend on cyber defense. When do you know you've done enough? So you never know you've done enough is the simple answer to that. It's about making decisions that are practical and pragmatic. And the done enough really comes down to a judgment. And that's why I say it's about risk appetite, and the board should make a decision around risk appetite. If you think that your likely exposure in a breach is taking the average $4.3 million, then spending $10 million to avoid it happening is probably spending too much, because it's cheaper to have the hit. If you think it's $4.3 million and you've only spent $1 million, that might not be enough. So it's a risk-based judgment based on your own assessment of risk, your own assessment of exposure, your own kind of, if we're breached, how much will insurance cover? What business will we lose? How long will it take us to recover? That tells you how much you need to spend, because you're going to spend whatever it takes to close down the attack vectors which are most likely to hurt you. Now, the good news is that in most instances, it's going to cost way less than $4.3 million, because most of the successful attacks, as you've seen, is around compromised credentials, phishing attacks, software configuration, and those you can deal with relatively inexpensively. The high investment comes from technology investment. And as I've said in this webinar, it's not about technology, it's about the governance, risk management, and compliance issues that you put in place. So you can probably actually, if you do all of that thoroughly and systematically, keep the cost of managing your exposure well below the likely cost of the breach if one were to occur. I mentioned that a company spending 10% of revenue on cyber defense, I use the 10% number because it originates with a number of hackers who say, in their judgment, organizations who are spending less than 10% of revenue make it much easier for them, hackers, to get involved in penetrating those organizations. It's not a rule, but it's a yardstick, if you like. And you know, as I said, how much you should spend is a judgment. It's a board risk appetite judgment. 10% of revenue is simply one yardstick. The financial exposure, if we have a breach, is another yardstick. That's maybe a ceiling as to what we should spend. How do we achieve the same results spending less? And that's why it's a board decision. It's not about saying to the IT team, hey, you get $4.3 million, make sure we don't get breached, because that won't work. You will be breached. It's about saying $4.3 million is on average our exposure. How do we not have that exposure? How do we bring that exposure down to maybe $500,000 or $1 million by spending maybe $500,000 or $1 million? You're never going to be able to eliminate exposure totally. So it's about getting expenditure down to a level that kind of makes sense given the area. So I hope that's a sensible answer. Data protection officer and DPO. Yes, data protection manager and DPO could well be a separate function. It's a good point. That's why we put DPO in brackets. The person who is managing data inside the organization is not necessarily going to be the data protection officer. If you have to, by law, have a data protection officer, that's a regulated function. If you give to somebody the job of being data protection manager, but call them the DPO, they are automatically a regulated DPO, and they're not allowed to make decisions about the means and purpose of processing data. A data protection manager can. So being really clear about the roles of data protection manager and DPO is critical. DPO has got a critical role about ensuring the organization is taking adequate steps to put in place what GDPR calls technical and organizational measures to ensure that data protection is at a level which is appropriate for the current state of the art. And that looks, as my voice begins to wear out, as though I'm coming to the end of the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, if any final questions, please do bung them into the question section. So I think not. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, bang on 5 o'clock. Pretty well bang on 5 o'clock. Thank you all for joining the webinar. I hope it's been useful. I hope there's useful ideas and thoughts and inputs there. Please do, if there's ways in which we can help you, particularly as we come up to the end of this financial year, you'll find us really interested in making the affordability of cyber defense even more in your favor. Do take advantage of that, but above all, do take appropriate steps to make sure you don't join the headlines of organizations who have been breached. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found it useful. Stay safe. Bye-bye.